Chapter 1. The World of Roman Religion. When we enter the world of the ancient Romans, we enter a universe filled with gods, spirits, and rituals. For the Romans, religion was not just a private matter or matter of personal conviction, but an omnipresent part of social, political, and military life. They lived in the awareness that the gods were present in every action, in every campaign, in every harvest cycle. Everything that happened was permeated by the divine order, and it was a task of men to act in harmony with this divine power. The Romans referred to this attitude with the word religio, a term that meant both respect and obligation. The Roman religion was pragmatic in many ways. It was less focused on personal revelation or spiritual ecstasy, but on correct action towards the gods. The Romans believed that the well-being of the state, families, and each individual citizen depended on the gods being pleased. Their goodwill could be won by offering sacrifices, taking vows, or celebrating festivals in their honor. They could also be enraged if rituals were disregarded or oaths were broken. This idea led to a religion that functioned like a contract between man and God. Do ut des, I give so that you give. Offerings were not gifts of love or reverence, but part of a mutual obligation. The origins of Roman religion lay in a mixture of different influences. Even before the emergence of the city of Rome, Italian tribes had their own ideas of divine forces that dwelt in rivers, trees, springs, and fields. These forces of nature were not necessarily thought of in human form, but as invisible but effective forces. With the expansion of Rome and the contacts with the Etruscans and Greeks, more and more elements were added. From the Etruscans, for example, the Romans adopted the art of divination, while from the Greeks they absorbed the rich world of myths and gods. But they always remained Romans. They translated the foreign gods into their own order, gave them new names and adapted them to their needs. So Zeus became Jupiter, Hera Juno, Ars Mars. A central feature of the Roman religion was its function as a state cult. While in many other cultures religion tended to fall into the realm of priests or mystics, in Rome it was an essential part of politics. The highest priestly offices were held by respected senators or even by the emperor himself. The Pontifex Maximus, the highest priest, was one of the most important figures in public life. Decisions about war and peace, about building projects or laws were not made without first consulting the gods. This was done by sacrificial acts or by augurs who interpreted the flight of the birds and read divine signs from it. If the omen was unfavorable, a decision was postponed or a new ritual was performed to win the favor of the gods. This close link between religion and politics had far-reaching consequences. It made religion a stabilizing element that promoted the unity of the empire. As long as the gods were favorable, Rome could grow, conquer, and prosper. Defeats, on the other hand, were often interpreted as a sign of divine envy. It was then necessary to restore the balance through new temples, larger sacrifices, or the introduction of foreign gods. As a result, in the course of its history, Rome added more and more deities to its pantheon, from the Phrygian Cybele to the Egyptian Isis. This openness was not a sign of arbitrariness, but an expression of a deeply pragmatic attitude. If a deity was powerful and proved helpful, then he had earned his place in Roman worship. Religion in Rome was not only a question of the great state festivals, but also of everyday life. Each family worshipped their household gods, the Lares and Penates, who watched over the hearth and supplies. When entering the house, small victims were lit, and they were remembered at mealtime. Birth, marriage, and death were accompanied by ritual acts to ensure that the invisible world of the gods remained well-disposed. Even when traveling or in foreign cities, the Roman looked for temples where he could offer his sacrifices. Religious practice was so deeply embedded in everyday life that there was hardly an act that was not connected to the gods in some way. It is also noteworthy that the Roman religion was less based on sacred scriptures or dogmas. There was no Bible, no holy book that laid down what had to be believed. Instead, the ritual itself was the core of the religion. It was not so much a matter of whether one was convinced of a deity in one's innermost being, but of performing the sacrifices correctly, speaking the right words, not interrupting the ceremony. This emphasis on the formal made the religion flexible and adaptable, but also strict. A prayer spoken incorrectly could invalidate an entire ceremony and had to be repeated. With this attitude, Rome succeeded in creating a religion that functioned for centuries and supported the foundation of a world power. The gods were not only figures of mythology, but partners in a constant exchange of duties and gifts. They were guarantors of order, guardians of morality, and judges of people's deeds. But at the same time, they were also mirrors of Roman society itself, strict, disciplined, hierarchical, but open to new things as long as they served the greater good. When we look back at the world of Roman religion today, we see not only a distant past, but also the origin of many cultural traditions that continue to have an impact on the present. The names of the planets, many religious festivals, and even our understanding of law and order bear traces of this ancient world of gods. Before we turn to the individual deities, it is therefore worthwhile to understand this basis: the Roman religion as a system that permeated the life of an entire people and has not lost its fascination to this day. Chapter 2. From the Etruscans to the Romans, Cultural Roots. The Roman religion was not a product that came out of nowhere. It grew in a space that was shaped by many cultures and developed from a mixture of ancient traditions, local beliefs, and foreign influences. Anyone who wants to understand the Roman gods must therefore take a look back at those peoples who lived before and alongside the Romans. The Etruscans and Greeks, in particular, played a crucial role in shaping what later became known as the Roman pantheon. The Etruscans, who lived in north-central Italy, were a people with a rich and mysterious culture. Their language has not been fully deciphered to this day, but their art, architecture, and, above all, their religious practices have left deep marks. The Romans adopted not only symbols from the Etruscans, but also a certain way of seeing the world. For the Etruscans, the universe was an ordered whole ruled by the gods, and people had to find their place in this order through rituals and prophecies. In particular, the art of the augurs, the interpretation of bird flight and natural signs, was a legacy that Rome took over directly from the Etruscan religion. The Romans valued this practice so much that they set up their own colleges of augurs, which became indispensable for important political decisions. The discipline of the haruspices, those priests who read the entrails of sacrificial animals to discern the will of the gods, was also an Etruscan heritage. This may seem strange or even repulsive to us today, but to the Romans it was a highly respected and precise method of interpreting divine signs. Every military campaign, every important building project could only begin when the gods had signaled their approval through such rituals. These practices clearly show how much religion was an instrument for securing order and stability in Rome. From the Etruscans, the Romans also adopted certain gods and symbols. Tinia, the Etruscan god of the sky, found his counterpart in Jupiter, while the goddess Juno passed into Juno and Minerva into Minerva. These translations were not simply copies, but adaptations to the Roman character. The Romans turned these gods into figures that were more focused on law, order, and social stability, and less on individual drama, as was the case in Greek myths, for example. The Greeks, on the other hand, shaped Rome in a different way. Early on, the Romans were in contact with the Greek colonies in southern Italy, especially in Campania and Sicily. There they encountered a rich world of myths, epic poetry, and artistically shaped gods. The Greeks had embedded their gods in stories, brought them to life in dramas and poems, and these stories also captivated the Romans. They took up the Greek myths, translated the names of the gods, and combined them with their own religious practice. So Ars became Mars, Aphrodite Venus, Hermes Mercury. But the Roman approach to these takeovers was always determined by pragmatism. The Romans valued Greek mythology, but they did not make it an end in itself. While the Greeks often portrayed their gods as figures with human weaknesses and passions, the Romans stuck to a more sober image. For them, the gods were not only characters in stories, but above all powers that influenced the fate of the state. The myths were useful to explain the gods vividly, but what was decisive was the ritual, the right sacrifice, the exact formulation of the prayers. In addition to the Etruscans and Greeks, other Italic peoples also played a role in the development of Roman religion. The Sabines, a mountain people in central Italy, brought important cults with them, such as that of Quirinus, who was later closely associated with Romulus, the legendary founder of the city. The god Semo Sancus, a guardian of the oaths, also found his way into the Roman pantheon. Such influences show that Rome was a melting pot from the beginning, absorbing elements from many directions and forming them into its own system. This openness to foreign influences was a central feature of Roman religion. It made it possible for Rome to integrate new deities into its pantheon as it expanded, without losing its own identity. Even in the early centuries, it was customary to include foreign cults if they seemed useful or could calm the people. When Hannibal and his troops stood at the gates of Rome, the Senate resorted to the Phrygian goddess Cybele, whose cult was brought to Rome in order to appease the gods. This pragmatic attitude was a key to the religious and political stability of the empire. So when we look at the roots of Roman religion, we see a network of traditions, influences, and adaptations. The Romans were not inventors from nothing, but skillful designers who created a uniform order from foreign elements. They combined Etruscan ritual rigor with Greek mythology and Italic tribal cults to create a system that was both stable and flexible. This ability to absorb foreign ideas and make them usable for one's own purposes is perhaps one of the greatest strengths of Roman culture. The Roman religion was therefore a mirror of its political and social development from the beginning. Just as Rome itself grew from a small settlement to a world power, so did the pantheon. It became larger, more diverse, more international. But despite all the diversity, the basic principle remained the same. Religion served to secure order, to bind people and gods through rituals and contracts. This foundation was laid by the early influences, especially those of the Etruscans and Greeks, and without them the Roman pantheon would never have come into being in the form we know. Chapter 3. Jupiter, King of the Gods. Jupiter, also called Jupiter Optimus Maximus by the Romans, was the highest deity in the Roman pantheon. In it, power, authority, and divine order were united. He was the god of heaven, lightning, and thunder, but above all the guardian of law, morality, and state. No other god embodied the political and religious ideals of Rome so strongly. While many gods primarily watched over certain areas of life, such as Mars over war or Venus over love, Jupiter stood above everything. He was the symbol of domination and supreme justice, the judge of men as well as of gods. The Romans adopted him in large parts from the Greeks, who worshipped him as Zeus. But they gave it a new form that corresponded to their own nature. While Zeus often appears in myths as a capricious, passionate, and sometimes fallible god, the Romans shaped Jupiter into a more serious, majestic figure. He was less an actor in colorful stories and more a symbol of order and discipline. In its Roman form, it embodied not only the power of heaven, but also the power of the state itself. Jupiter's most important place of worship was a temple on the Capitoline Hill in Rome. He was not only religious, but also politically the heart of the city. Here, every consulate began with a sacrifice to Jupiter, and this is where the generals swore their oaths before going to war. The temple was the visible sign that Jupiter was guiding the fate of Rome. Together with Juno and Minerva, he formed the so-called Capitoline Triad, a kind of divine governing body that was closely linked to the Roman state. The title Optimus Maximus, the best and greatest, made it clear that Jupiter was not just any god, but the embodiment of the highest authority to which all others had to orient themselves. A central symbol of Jupiter was lightning. He was considered a visible sign of his power, a divine instrument with which he inflicted punishments and enforced his authority. Those who disregarded the divine or human order risked being struck by his lightning. In many Roman ideas, lightning was also an omen that predicted the future. Priests examined the direction and strength of lightning in order to deduce the will of Jupiter. In this way, even a natural event became a means of divine communication. Jupiter was not only the god of power and war, but also the guardian of the laws. He was considered a guarantor of oaths and treaties. Anyone who broke a promise not only turned against his fellow man, but also insulted Jupiter personally. This made him the patron saint of public and private law. This role gave him a moral dimension that went far beyond his function as a god of heaven. He was not only the ruler of the elements, but also the guardian of human society, whose stability was based on trust and loyalty to treaties. In the depiction, Jupiter usually appeared as a majestic, enthroned figure. He carried a scepter as a sign of his rule, and at his side was often an eagle, which was considered his sacred animal. This image shaped the understanding of authority far beyond antiquity. The eagle, later also used as a symbol of Roman legions, became a symbol of power and divine protection. In the art of the Middle Ages and modern times, too, there are many depictions that go back to the Romans' image of Jupiter. But Jupiter was not just an abstract figure, but had a living role in the everyday life of the Romans. Farmers made sacrifices to him to ask for good harvests. Commanders dedicated booty to him after successful campaigns. Families prayed to him when they sought shelter from disaster. His cult was not limited to an elite, but permeated all strata of society. Nevertheless, he was always closely associated with the idea of state power. No other god was so much the god of Rome itself, of its victories, its expansion, and its laws. The Roman emperors also soon realized how important Jupiter was for their rule. Many presented themselves as his chosen ones or even as his sons. Some emperors emphasized in inscriptions that their power was granted directly by Jupiter. In this way, religion and politics merged even more closely. Jupiter became the divine guarantor of imperial power and thus a symbol of the legitimacy of the entire empire. But as strong as his worship was, with the rise of Christianity his cult began to wane. Fewer and fewer people made sacrifices to him, his temples fell into disrepair, and finally he almost completely disappeared from public life. Nevertheless, his name remained alive. The largest planet in our solar system carries it to this day, and it also lives on in language, for example in the days of the week, which in some languages still have references to Jupiter or its Greek counterpart Zeus. So Jupiter was more than just a god of thunder. He was the embodiment of the Roman order, the guarantor of law and contract, the highest guardian of the state. It reflected the strength and ambition of Rome, an empire that saw itself as the center of the world and legitimized its power through divine will. By worshipping Jupiter, the Romans ultimately honored their own idea of rule and order. Chapter 4. Juno, protector of marriage and family. Juno was one of the most important deities of the Roman pantheon and occupied a place right next to Jupiter. Together with him and Minerva, she formed the Capitoline Triad, which was venerated in the temple on the Capitoline Hill and was considered the heart of the Roman state religion. While Jupiter was the supreme god who watched over law and order, Juno embodied above all protection, dignity, and the special position of women within marriage and society. She was queen of heaven, sister, and at the same time wife of Jupiter, and thus the female complement to his power. Its origins date back to the early Italic religion, which revered various aspects of female fertility, motherhood, and domestic protection. The Romans summarized these ideas in the figure of Juno, which they endowed with many qualities. For each woman there was, so to speak, her own Juno, a kind of personal guardian spirit that accompanied her stages of life. Especially at birth, Juno was considered the patron saint, as she watched over the forces that produced new life. In this role, she was closely associated with Ceres, the goddess of fertility, but differed in her connection to marriage and family. A central aspect of Juno was her role as guardian of marriage. It stood for the sacred union between man and woman, which in the Roman understanding was not only a private matter, but a social institution. Marriage served not only as a personal bond, but also as a means of passing on assets, names, and status. By watching over this connection, Juno secured the foundation of society itself. Their worship was therefore closely linked to wedding rituals. The month of June, which still bears her name today, was considered particularly favorable for marriages. Many Roman families waited until this month to celebrate weddings in order to secure the special blessing of the goddess. But Juno was more than just a mild protector. She also had a combative side, which was expressed in her epithet Juno Sospita, which means the protector. In this form, she was depicted as a warrior, with a helmet and shield, ready to defend her city and her people. Especially in Lazio, where she had an ancient place of worship in Lanuvium, she was worshipped as a strong and combative goddess who protected not only families but also entire communities. This dual role, as a gentle protector of domestic life and as a combative guardian of the city, makes Juno a multi-layered deity that cannot be reduced to a single image. Her role as Juno Regina, the Queen of Heaven, was also particularly important. In this function, she was equal to Jupiter and reflected his power at the female level. For many Roman women, she thus became the highest figure of identification, a symbol of female dignity and strength. Unlike Venus, who stood for love, beauty, and passion, Juno embodied seriousness, a sense of duty and the institution of family. It was the counterpart to the often stormy and passionate Jupiter, but at the same time it was also its corrective. Some accounts indicate that Juno could also be jealous and angry when Jupiter became unfaithful. These traits, which she shared with the Greek hero, show that despite her majesty, she also embodied human feelings. The cultic worship of Juno was manifold in Rome. There were numerous temples in her honor, the most important of which stood in the Capitoline temple complex. There she received offerings and festivals that underlined her importance for the city. A particularly important festival was the Matronalia, which was celebrated on the 1st of March. On this day, husbands honored their wives, gave them gifts and prayed for the happiness of marriage. At the same time, the women made sacrifices to secure the protection of the goddess for their family. This festival illustrates how closely the veneration of Juno was linked to the social structures of Roman life. Juno also played a role in the political sphere. As a goddess who watched over treaties and alliances, she was as important to the stability of the state as Jupiter. At ceremonial occasions and political meetings, it was invoked to ensure compliance with agreements. In times of war, they were associated with the protection of the city, so that their cult spanned private and public life at the same time. It is interesting to note that Juno was also integrated into the Roman expansion. When Rome subjugated other cities, it often adopted their deities into its own cult. Thus, Juno Regina was brought from Veii to Rome after the city had been conquered. This procedure, known as evocation, was based on the idea that the patron deity of a city could be persuaded to change sides and henceforth favor Rome. The fact that such an important goddess as Juno played a role in this practice shows how important she was for Rome's self-understanding. With the rise of Christianity, Juno, like most Roman gods, lost its central role. Their temples fell into disrepair, and their festivals were replaced by new traditions. But her figure did not disappear completely. In some respects, she lived on in the image of the Christian Mary, who was also venerated as the Queen of Heaven. These parallels show how strongly the idea of a female protective figure was anchored in Roman culture and how it continued to have an effect even after the end of paganism. Juno was a goddess who combined many facets: the protective mother, the strict guardian of marriage, the fierce defender, and the majestic Queen of Heaven. It stood for stability and order, but also for passion and anger. It reflected the hopes, fears, and ideals of the Romans. By venerating Juno, they also honored the institutions that governed their lives: marriage, the family, the state. Their role in the pantheon was therefore not only religious, but profoundly social and political. Chapter 5. Neptune, ruler of the seas. Neptune was the Roman god of the seas, rivers, and all waters. In the imagination of the Romans, he controlled the mighty forces of the ocean, directed storms, caused waves to rise and calmed them again. As the god of the unpredictable sea, he was a fearsome ruler on the one hand, but also a giver of fertility and wealth on the other, because the sea brought not only danger, but also food and trade routes. Neptune thus occupied a position in the pantheon that was closely linked to the economic and military interests of Rome, even if it never played the same central role as Jupiter or Mars. His figure is strongly influenced by Poseidon, the Greek god of the sea. When Rome came into contact with Greek culture, it adopted many elements of the cult of Poseidon, but adapted them to its own needs. While Poseidon was a central figure with a rich mythological tradition in Greece, Neptune initially had only a limited significance in Rome. Originally, he was probably worshipped primarily as the god of fresh water and springs, which was crucial for an agrarian society. It was only later, when Rome rose to become a maritime and trading power, that it became more and more identified with the open sea, gaining the characteristics that we associate with it today. In Roman art and imagination, Neptune was depicted as a strong man with a long beard holding a trident in his hand. This symbol, which also characterized its Greek counterpart, was an expression of its dominion over the waters. With it, he could whip up or calm waves, smash ships, or escort them to safety. He was often shown on a chariot pulled by seahorses or sea creatures, accompanied by nereids and tritons. These images made him a majestic but also menacing figure that reflected the Romans' ambivalent relationship with the sea. For a long time, the Romans were not a pronounced seafaring people compared to the Greeks and Phoenicians. Their rise began in the countryside, through conquests in Italy and later in the provinces. It was not until the battle against Carthage in the 3rd century BC that they were forced to build a strong fleet. During this time, Neptune also gained in importance, as the sea now became the decisive scene of political and military conflicts. With the victory over Carthage and control of the western Mediterranean, Neptune became a symbol of Rome's maritime power. In addition to his role as a sea god, Neptune also had a close connection to horses. Early on, he was revered as Neptune Equester, i.e. the patron god of horses and horse racing. This connection also comes from the Greek region, where Poseidon was considered the inventor of the horse. In Rome, this had a special significance, as horses played a central role in the military as well as in circus games. The cult of Neptune Equester shows that his power included not only the wild waves, but also the tamed power of animals. An important festival in honor of Neptune was the Neptunalia, which was celebrated at the end of July. This festival fell during the hottest time of the year, when fields and people suffered from the drought. For the occasion, the Romans erected tabernacles where they celebrated, drank, and made sacrifices. The festival was less austere and solemn than many other religious occasions, but had an almost summer festive atmosphere. It served to win the favor of the god for rain and fertile fields, but also to ask for protection from the dangers of water, especially for travelers and merchants. In mythology, Neptune, like Poseidon, had a stormy and passionate nature. He was considered impetuous, easily irritable, and often difficult to control. Stories about his love affairs and his children show that he was not only master of the forces of nature, but also of the unbridled power of life itself. Many heroes and mythical figures trace their ancestry back to him, underlining his importance as a father figure. Despite these aspects, Neptune remained rather a marginal figure in the political and religious life of Rome compared to Jupiter, Juno, or Mars. His cult was important, but it was never the focus of the state religion. This is also due to the fact that Rome, despite its fleets and its control over the Mediterranean, has always remained a power with a focus on the land. The legions, not the fleet, carried the glory and expansion of the empire. Thus, Neptune remained respected and feared, but he never achieved the same popularity as other great gods. With the Christianization of the empire, the cult of Neptune gradually disappeared. But his image lived on, not least in Renaissance art, in which he was taken up again as a symbol of the mastery of nature and maritime power. Modern depictions of the sea god, whether in statues, paintings, or popular media, also bear traces of this ancient Roman idea. His trident, his chariot, and his fierce majesty are still unmistakable signs of a divine power that gives people life and can bring death at the same time. For the Romans, Neptune was a deity full of ambivalence. On the one hand, life-giving, since water and fertility were inseparably linked; on the other hand, destructive and unpredictable like the stormy sea. It reflected the double face of nature, which the Romans feared and revered in equal measure. In his form, the brute force of the sea combined with the tamed power of horses, two symbols that impressively illustrate how the Romans saw the world, as something that could be mastered but never fully controlled. Chapter 6. Mars, god of war and father of Rome. Mars was one of the most important gods of the Roman religion and uniquely embodied the military spirit that shaped the Roman people. While many gods symbolized certain areas of life, Mars was at the same time a warrior, protector, and mythical ancestor of the city of Rome. It combined destructive power and fertility, violence and protection. Mars represented the energy that could win wars, but also the power that created life and strengthened communities. This complexity makes him one of the most fascinating figures in the pantheon. His roots go back to the early Italian religion, in which he was not only a god of war, but also watched over fields and crops. In this original form, Mars was a fertility god who protected agriculture and livestock. This explains why his worship always began with the month of March, which is named after him and opened the agricultural and military year. With Rome's rise to become a military superpower, however, its character increasingly shifted. The agrarian patron god became the god of war par excellence, the symbol of Rome's military strength and expansion. In the Roman imagination, Mars was the father of Romulus and Remus, the legendary twins who founded Rome. The story tells that Mars fathered the two sons with the Vestal virgin Rhea Silvia, who were later suckled and raised by a she-wolf. This mythical ancestry gave Mars a special significance for the self-image of the Romans. He was not only a protector of the empire, but its actual ancestor. By venerating him, they also honored their own origins and legitimized their military power as God-given. Mars was depicted in art as a strong, young man, often in full armor with helmet, spear, and shield. Unlike its Greek counterpart Ares, who was considered chaotic and bloodthirsty, Mars had a dignity and seriousness in Roman culture. He was not only an embodiment of violence, but a righteous warrior who fought in the service of order and the state. This distinction is important because it shows how much the Romans used their religion to mirror their own ideals. Mars stood for discipline, courage, and sacrifice, virtues that were central to Roman society. His cult was of the utmost importance in Rome. The Campus Martius, the Field of Mars, was a central place of political and military life. This is where meetings took place, where the soldiers practiced, where war and peace were decided. Another important sanctuary was the Temple of Mars altar, Mars the Avenger, which Emperor Augustus had built to atone for Caesar's assassination and to emphasize the divine support of his rule. Mars was therefore not only a god worshipped by simple soldiers, but also a symbol of the power of the emperors and Rome's claim to worldwide domination. Festivals in honor of Mars were numerous and important. The beginning of March, when the military year was opened, was particularly significant. In solemn ceremonies, the weapons were blessed and the god was asked for protection for the coming campaigns. During the October Horse, one of Rome's oldest and most mysterious festivals, a horse was sacrificed to secure Mars' favor. These festivals showed how closely Mars was connected to warfare, but also to the cycles of life. The transition from peace to war, from sowing to harvesting, was always placed under his protection. In addition to its role as the god of war, Mars also remained alive in its ancient function as the god of fertility. This side was evident in his connection to the rural communities that invoked him as the guardian of their fields and herds. Thus, Mars became a deity who embodied violence and life in equal measure. This connection between war and fertility may seem contradictory at first glance, but for the Romans it was logical. War ensured expansion and access to new resources, fertility ensured survival. Both forces were essential to the prosperity of the community, and Mars united them. The importance of Mars also reached into Roman politics. The Senate and the emperors used his veneration to legitimize their decisions. A victorious general could claim to have been personally supported by Mars. Defeats, on the other hand, were often interpreted as a sign that the god was angry and demanded new victims. Religion was so closely intertwined with political life that Mars served not only as a divine patron saint, but also as a mirror of Roman power. With the rise of Christianity, the importance of Mars also dwindled. His temples fell into disrepair, and his strongholds lost weight. But its reverberations remained, not only in the name of the month March, but also in the image of the idealized warrior that lives on in many cultures to this day. The planet Mars bears his name and is still associated with power, energy, and struggle. For the Romans, Mars was much more than a god of war. He was the father of the city, protector of the empire, symbol of military discipline, and at the same time an ancient god of fertility. In its form, the Roman ideal of strength and order was combined with the mythical origin of the city. By worshipping Mars, the Romans honored their own identity, a people who rose through fighting spirit, discipline, and unwavering trust in divine support. Chapter 7. Venus, goddess of love and beauty. Venus was one of the most dazzling and popular figures in the Roman pantheon. While Jupiter symbolized power and order and Mars stood for the warlike spirit, Venus embodied love, beauty, fertility, and the seductive power that captivated humans and gods alike. She was not only a goddess of passion, but also a patron saint of community, family, and ultimately even of the state itself. Its complexity explains why it gained a central position in the course of Roman history and became one of the most important deities for Rome's identity. Their origins are complex. Even in the early Italic religion, there were deities associated with fertility and nature, but the actual form of Venus only emerged through the close connection with the Greek Aphrodite. The Romans adopted numerous characteristics and myths from it, but adapted it to their own culture. While Aphrodite often appeared unpredictable, capricious, and sometimes even destructive in Greek stories, Venus was given greater political and social weight in Rome. She was understood not only as the goddess of individual love, but also as a guarantor of cohesion and harmony that strengthened the community. Her performance was characterized by unmistakable sensuality. In art and literature, she appeared as the perfect embodiment of female beauty, often naked or in transparent garments. But her power lay not only in outer beauty, but in the power of love itself. Venus embodied the principle of attraction that connected all beings, humans, gods, animals, and even the forces of nature. In this function, she was not only a goddess of erotic passion, but also a cosmic power that ordered and held together life in all its forms. Festivals in their honor were firmly anchored in the Roman calendar. On April 1st, the Veneralia was celebrated, a festival at which women in particular made sacrifices to the goddess and asked her for help in matters of love and marriage. Merchants and craftsmen also asked Venus for goodwill, as her power was effective not only in private but also in public life. The versatility of her veneration is also reflected in the different epithets she bore. Venus Genetrix as the progenitor, Venus Victrix as the victor, who favored military victories, or Venus Felix, who bestowed good luck and prosperity. In Rome, numerous magnificent temples were built in her honor. Julius Caesar had a temple built for Venus Genetrix on the Roman Forum to make his divine lineage visible. Pompey also dedicated a temple to Venus Victrix after he had achieved great military successes. These examples show how much the worship of Venus was intertwined with politics and self-promotion. She was not only the goddess of lovers, but also a patron saint of power and victory. Their mythological stories reflected the whole range of human emotions. Venus could be loving and tender, but also jealous, scheming, and vengeful. Her connection to Mars, the god of war, was one of the most famous love stories of the ancient world. This relationship combined two seemingly opposing principles: love and war, tenderness and violence. The Romans did not see this as a paradox, but as a truth about life itself, that passion and struggle can be closely linked. The effect of Venus went far beyond religion. Poets such as Ovid and Virgil made her a central figure in her works. Virgil portrayed her in the Aeneid as the protective mother of Aeneas, who guides and supports him so that he can fulfill his divine mission. Ovid, on the other hand, emphasized her playful, seductive side in his Amores and in the Ars Amatoria. These literary images shaped the understanding of Venus until modern times. With the spread of Christianity, Venus also lost her official cult, but her figure never completely disappeared. In Renaissance art, it became one of the most popular motifs. Botticelli's Birth of Venus or Titian's Venus of Urbino draw on the ancient goddess to represent beauty, eroticism, and joie de vivre. Her image also lives on in modern pop culture, be it in literature, film, or music. Venus remains the symbol of feminine beauty and the universal power of love. For the Romans, however, it was much more than a symbol. She was a living goddess who watched over her life, blessed her marriages, supported her victories, and formed the foundation of her self-concept. In Venus, sensuality and politics, privacy and state power, beauty and cosmic order were united. Their power lay not only in moving hearts, but also in the ability to rally an entire people around a common divine ancestor. Venus was thus a goddess who touched both the most intimate and the greatest, the love of two people and the fate of a world power. It reflected the longing for beauty and harmony, but also the realization that love is a driving force of the story. For the Romans, therefore, she was not just a goddess, but a principle that permeated everything, from the feelings of the individual to the destiny of the state. Chapter 8. Apollo, god of light, music, and prophecy. Apollo occupies a special position in the Roman pantheon, because he is one of the few gods that the Romans adopted almost unchanged from the Greeks. While many Greek deities were given new names and cast in a Roman mold, Apollo remained Apollo in Rome. This was not only due to his great popularity, but also because he embodied qualities that the Romans admired: beauty, harmony, clarity of mind, and at the same time a deep connection to art and prophecy. He was a god who not only appealed to the senses, but also shaped the mind and thought. In Greece, Apollo was the god of light, music, healing, and divination. He took all these aspects with him to Rome. For the Romans, who were often strongly focused on ritual and state cult in their religion, Apollo brought an almost poetic dimension into it. His veneration was combined with the idea of harmony, order, and renewal. As the god of light, he stood for clarity and truth, as the god of music for beauty and creativity, and as the god of prophecy for access to knowledge that went beyond human understanding. His cult in Rome gained particular importance during the late Republic and the early imperial period. As early as the 5th century BC, Apollo was called to Rome as the god of epidemic defense when a plague struck the city. But his real rise began with Augustus, who closely associated himself with Apollo. Augustus saw in Apollo a divine patron of his rule and had the magnificent temple of Apollo built in his honor on the Palatine Hill. There, the god was worshipped in a form that made him appear not only as an artistic and healing protector, but also as a political protector. Through Augustus, Apollo became a symbol of the new order that the emperor wanted to bring to Rome and the empire. In art, Apollo was usually depicted as a youthful, beautiful god, with a laurel wreath on his head and a kithara or lyre in his hand. This performance underlined his connection to music and poetry. The laurel tree was sacred to him because, according to a well-known legend, it had emerged from his love for the nymph Daphne. When it escaped his pursuit, it turned into a laurel tree, and Apollo adopted it as his symbol. In Rome, the laurel wreath later also became a sign of victory and adorned the heads of generals and emperors. In this way, the aesthetic dimension of Apollo was combined with the political life of the Romans. As the god of prophecy, Apollo was closely associated with the famous Oracle of Delphi, which also played an important role for the Romans. Numerous legations traveled there to get answers to political or military questions. Although Delphi was in Greece, the authority of Apollo as the god of prophecy worked as far as Rome. His cult made it clear that the Romans sought divine guidance not only in rituals, but also in visions and prophecies. Another important aspect of Apollo was his role as the god of healing. Early on, it was associated with the defense against diseases and epidemics. In Rome, sacrifices were made to him when epidemics broke out, and his healing powers were at the center of many prayers. At the same time, he was considered the father of Asclepius, who was worshipped as an independent healing god. Apollo was thus part of a tradition that combined both practical medical help and divine assistance. But Apollo also had a darker side. As the god of the bow, he could bring illness and death with his arrows. This dual nature made him an ambivalent figure who both healed and destroyed. In this respect, he was a god who embodied the balance of powers: light and shadow, healing and destruction, beauty and danger. In Rome, Apollo remained closely associated with cultural and artistic ideals. Poets, musicians, and artists regarded him as their patron saint. Especially in the Augustan period, when art and literature flourished, Apollo was a symbol of the harmony between divine order and human creativity. Augustus himself liked to be moved close to Apollo in order to present his reign as a golden age of culture. Despite its importance, Apollo was never quite at the center of the state cult in Rome. Jupiter, Juno, Mars, or Venus played a greater role in public life. Nevertheless, Apollo remained an indispensable figure who was invoked especially in times of crisis. His function as the god of light and truth made him a symbol of hope and spiritual clarity in a world that was often marked by uncertainty. With the fall of the old religions, Apollo also lost his official cult, but his figure survived the times. In the Renaissance, he became the ideal image of the beautiful, harmonious person. His connection to music and art made him a symbol of humanist ideals, and to this day he appears as the embodiment of beauty, creativity, and renewal. For the Romans, however, Apollo was not only an ideal, but a living god. He stood at the intersection of religion, politics, and culture. By worshipping Apollo, they honored not only a god, but also principles that they understood to be the foundation of their society: clarity, truth, harmony, and the power of art. He was a god who embodied life in its brightest form and at the same time reminded us that shadows can also be hidden in the light. Chapter 9. Diana, goddess of the hunt and the moon. Diana was one of the most popular and at the same time most versatile goddesses in the Roman pantheon. It embodied nature in its wild, untamed form, but at the same time stood for purity, independence, and protection. As the goddess of hunting, the moon, and birth, she was a multi-layered figure who combined both power and care. Their cult was linked to ancient Italic traditions as well as to the influence of the Greek Artemis, whose characteristics the Romans transferred to Diana. This created a goddess who not only ruled the forests and animals, but also watched over the lives of women and was considered the protector of the weak and disenfranchised. Diana's origins go far back into the early Italic religion. Even before the Greeks gained influence in Italy with their Artemis, the inhabitants of central Italy worshipped a goddess who lived in the forests and at springs. She was considered the mistress of the hunt and the giver of fertility. With the spread of Roman power, this original goddess increasingly merged with the Greek Artemis, so that in the classical Roman period, Diana wore almost all the characteristics of her Greek sister. Nevertheless, her Roman identity was preserved, especially through her role as a protector of communities and outsiders. In Rome itself, the most important place of worship of Diana was the Aventine, one of the 7 hills of the city. There was a famous temple there, which, according to tradition, was founded in the 6th century BC by King Servius Tullius. This cult had a special significance because it was open not only to the Romans, but also to other Latin peoples. Diana thus became a goddess who was worshipped beyond the boundaries of individual cities and became a symbol of common identity. This openness shows her integrative power. She was not only a goddess for Rome, but for many Italian communities. A particularly strong image of Diana emerged in the idea of her independence. Like Artemis in Greece, Diana was a virgin goddess who did not submit to marriage or male authority. She lived freely in the woods, accompanied by nymphs, and hunted with bow and arrow. For many Roman women, she became a symbol of female self-determination. But this independence also made her a strict and implacable goddess. Anyone who violated its purity or disregarded it had to reckon with harsh punishment. In myths, she often appears as an avenger, cruelly punishing unauthorized advances or disrespectful behavior. In addition to her role as a hunting goddess, Diana was closely associated with the moon. As the goddess of heaven, she directed the rhythm of the nights and thus also the cycles of fertility and birth. Many women called on her during pregnancy and childbirth, believing that her power could give life and avert danger. In this capacity, she was closely associated with her sister Luna, who was worshipped as a moon goddess in her own right, but Diana often took over her duties and was seen as the real mistress of the night sky. A notable aspect of their cult was their connection to the weak and oppressed. In tradition, she was considered the patron goddess of slaves, who could find refuge at their altars. This side of Diana's shows that she not only appealed to the powerful or the ruling class, but also gave hope to those who were on the margins of society. This procession reflects a universal aspect of her power. She was a goddess who was there for everyone, regardless of status and origin. Her portrayal in art and literature emphasized her closeness to nature. Diana usually appeared as a young woman with a short chiton, with bow and quiver, sometimes accompanied by a deer or hunting dog. These pictures showed her as the mistress of the forests, roaming freely through nature. But her role as a moon goddess was also expressed in depictions that showed her with a crescent moon in her hair or surrounded by a silver shimmer. In this way, she combined the wild power of the earth and the quiet majesty of the sky. Festivals in honor of Diana took place regularly, and the festival on the 13th of August was particularly famous. This date was considered their holy day and was celebrated with sacrifices and celebrations. It was believed that in this hot summertime nature was particularly permeated by its power. Offerings to Diana were supposed to bring protection, ensure fertility, and bring about healing. Women played a central role in this festival, which underlined their importance as female patron goddesses. Politically, Diana gained additional importance during the imperial period. Some emperors placed themselves near her in order to legitimize her rule by associating with a powerful goddess of order and nature. Especially in the provinces, where the worship of local goddesses was widespread, Diana's cult was easy to integrate. It became a bridge between Roman religion and regional traditions. With the advent of Christianity, Diana lost her role in public life, but like many other deities, she did not disappear completely. Her figure lived on in the imagination of witches and forest spirits, who were associated with her in later centuries. The moon cult also survived in various forms and tied in with old ideas of Diana. In Renaissance art, it was rediscovered as a symbol of chaste beauty and harmony with nature. For the Romans, however, Diana was first and foremost a goddess who radiated closeness and distance at the same time. She was strict and relentless when disregarded, but generous and caring when honored. It reflected the wild but life-giving side of nature. She was the patron saint of women, mistress of the forest, and at the same time goddess of heaven. Diana stood for freedom, purity, and protection, values that were deeply anchored in the Roman self-image. Its popularity lasted for centuries because it combined both the original and the sublime, embodying people's longing for a combination of nature, order, and divine protection. Chapter 10. Vulcan, god of fire and forges. Vulcanus, known by the Greeks as Hephaestus, was the god of fire, volcanoes, and blacksmithing in Roman religion. It combined the creative as well as the destructive power of fire, which could both give light and warmth and destroy it. His figure reflected the Romans' ambivalent attitude towards this elemental force of nature. They revered him as the creator of powerful works and weapons, but also feared him as the author of destructive fires and volcanic eruptions. The origins of his cult go deep into early Roman history. Long before Rome rose to become a world power, Vulcan was revered as the god of fire, which burned in hearths and forges, but also lurked in the depths of the earth. With the increasing influence of Greek culture, he took on the form of Hephaestus, the divine blacksmith. But while the Greeks saw Hephaestus primarily as an artistic craftsman, the Romans emphasized the destructive power of fire, which was a constant danger in their densely built-up city. A central festival in honor of Vulcan was the Vulcanalia, which was celebrated on August 23rd, a time when the summer heat made fires particularly likely. On this day, the Romans sacrificed fish, which they threw into the fire to divert the consuming fire from houses and fields. This symbolic act shows the pragmatic side of Roman religion. They tried to appease the anger of the god by offering him offerings that could be burned vicariously. In the cult of Vulcan, for example, fear was combined with hope, terror with trust. In mythology, Vulcan was often depicted as a limping god whose body was marked by a blemish. This symbolized the harshness of his work, forging, creating under pain and effort. Despite his physical weakness, he was unsurpassed in his craft. In his forge, which was imagined deep in the volcanoes, he made weapons and armor of unparalleled strength. Lightning for Jupiter, the sword of Aeneas, armor for heroes, all this came from his workshop. Thus, Vulcan was at the same time a god who influenced the fate of people and states through his craft. His marriage to Venus, the goddess of love and beauty, is one of the most famous episodes in mythology. This combination of two such contrasting figures, the crippled blacksmith marked by fire and the most beautiful of all goddesses, fascinated the Romans and was often processed in literature and art. It illustrated the tension between outer beauty and inner strength, between passion and pain. The fact that Venus often cheated on him with Mars reinforced the tragic side of his character, but at the same time made him a humanly approachable figure. Its proximity to the volcanoes was of central importance to the Romans. In particular, Mount Etna in Sicily and Mount Vesuvius near Campania were regarded as his workshops. Volcanic eruptions were considered an expression of his work or his anger. When Vesuvius destroyed Pompeii and Herculaneum in 79 AD, it was seen as the work of Vulcanus. This combination of mythological interpretation and natural disaster shows how deeply the Romans embedded natural events in their religious world. Vulcan was not only a god of destruction, but also a creator. His blacksmithing was considered the basis of many divine and human achievements. Weapons, tools, works of art, everything that was made of metal was ultimately under his protection. He was also a god of progress who advanced civilization by giving people the art of forging. In it, therefore, the destructive volcano was combined with the creative forge, a paradox that the Romans feared and admired at the same time. In Roman society, his cult played an important role, even if it never reached the popularity of Jupiter, Mars, or Venus. Especially in a city like Rome, which was repeatedly ravaged by devastating fires, the veneration of Vulcan was of existential importance. His temples were often located on the outskirts of the city, as if to deliberately keep him away from the busiest neighborhoods. The most important temple was located at the Roman Forum and was considered one of the oldest places of worship in the city. Sacrifices were regularly made there to appease the fire and at the same time honor its creative power. The dual nature of Vulcan was also reflected in his veneration by craftsmen. Blacksmiths saw in him their divine patron saint, someone who understood their efforts and their work. At the same time, however, he was also a warning to all Romans not to underestimate the dangers of fire. This mixture of closeness and distance, of admiration and fear, made his cult unique. With the rise of Christianity, the veneration of Vulcan disappeared, but his image endured. In the Renaissance and later art, it often appeared as a symbol of the creative artist who produces great things through effort and suffering. He also lives on in modern language. The word volcano is derived directly from his name and still reminds us of his power over fire from the depths of the earth. For the Romans, Vulcan was more than just a god of fire. He was the embodiment of the elemental power that could bring life and death at the same time. In his forge, weapons were created that decided wars, and at the same time his wrath could destroy cities. This combination of creator and destroyer made him one of the most impressive figures of the Roman gods. By venerating Vulcan, the Romans showed their reverence for the violence of nature and their hope of being able to channel this violence into creative channels through sacrifices and rituals. Chapter 11. Mercury, god of trade and messenger of the gods. Mercury was one of the most versatile and lively figures in the Roman pantheon. He combined qualities that at first glance seem contradictory. He was the god of trade and merchants, but at the same time he was also the patron god of thieves, travelers, and traders. In addition, he acted as a divine messenger who mediated between the worlds and brought messages from gods to humans. This multiple role made him a god who had an important function both in the everyday life of the Romans and in their religious ideas of order and movement. The Romans largely adopted Mercury from the Greeks, who knew a comparable shape in Hermes. From Hermes he inherited many of his qualities: the agility, the cunning, the business acumen, and the function as a messenger. But the Romans gave it a stronger economic character that suited their pragmatic thinking. While Hermes often attracts attention in Greek mythology with tricky adventures, Mercury was worshipped in Rome above all as a god who could bring prosperity and good luck in trade. For a society that was increasingly enriched by trade and exchange, he was therefore an indispensable patron god. His depiction is unmistakable. Mercury appeared as a young, dynamic god, often with wings on his sandals and a winged helmet that symbolized his speed. In his hand he carried the caduceus, a staff with two writhing snakes, which later became a symbol of trade, but also of medicine. This image of the busy, mobile god corresponded to his nature. He was always on the move, always on the move, always at the interfaces between men and gods, between order and cunning. An important festival in honor of Mercury was the Mercuralia, which was celebrated on the 15th of May. On this day, merchants made a pilgrimage to a spring near the Porta Capena in Rome to draw water and sprinkle it over their goods and books. In doing so, they hoped to gain Mercury's blessing, which promised them good luck in trade and protection from fraud. It is noteworthy that in this ritual, the merchants also asked for forgiveness if they themselves had cheated, a sign that Mercury was understood as a god who watched over honest trade as well as deception and trickery. In addition to its role in economic life, Mercury was also closely associated with travel. He was considered the patron god of paths, roads, and travelers. Anyone who embarked on a trading trip or dangerous mission asked Mercury for assistance. In a world where travel was often arduous and dangerous, this had enormous practical significance. Mercury symbolized safety on the streets, but also the success that grew from the movement of goods and people. As a messenger of the gods, Mercury took on another central role. He was the mediator who brought Jupiter's commands to the people and transmitted the messages of mortals to the gods. This function made him a figure who crossed the boundaries between the divine and human worlds. At the same time, he was also considered a psychopompos, i.e. the guide of souls into the underworld. This made him a companion in transitional situations, a god who guided not only trade but also the journey between life and death. In mythology, Mercury often appears as a cunning and agile god. Even as a newborn, he is said to have turned the hooves of his brother Apollo's cattle to cover their tracks, thus proving his cunning. Later, he mediated between Apollo and other gods, brought gifts, and created peace through negotiation. Such stories made him a figure who embodied cunning and intelligence without being considered evil. Rather, the Romans admired his cleverness, which they associated with success in trade and in life. Politically, Mercury played a less central role in the state cult than Jupiter or Mars, but it was indispensable for everyday economic life. Merchants, and craftsmen saw in him their patron, and his cult also spread quickly in the provinces where trade flourished. His connection with local deities is particularly interesting. In Gaul, for example, he merged with local gods and became one of the most revered deities in the region. This shows how flexible and adaptable his cult was, which could be easily integrated into different cultural contexts. His versatility made Mercury a god who had a very personal meaning for many Romans. For some, it was the guarantor of good business, for others the companion on journeys, for still others the messenger who connected them to the divine world. These different facets were not mutually exclusive, but complemented each other to form an image of Mercury as the god of movement, transition, and exchange. With the rise of Christianity, the cult of Mercury also disappeared, but its reverberations remained. Wednesday, dies Mercurii, still bears his name in many languages today, for example in French Mercredi or in Spanish Miércoles. His caduceus lives on as a symbol in trade and medicine, and his image as a nimble messenger is still present in modern popular culture. For the Romans, Mercury was a deity who was both familiar and unpredictable. He stood for the opportunities and risks of trade, for the safety and dangers of travel, for the clarity and ambiguity of language. It reflected the Roman understanding of a world that was in constant motion and in which success fell to those who acted wisely, flexibly, and decisively. As the god of trade and messenger of the gods, Mercury was thus not only a religious figure, but a symbol of the dynamism and versatility that characterized Rome itself. Chapter 12. Ceres, goddess of fertility and agriculture. Ceres was one of the oldest and at the same time most important goddesses in the Roman pantheon. It embodied the fertility of the earth, the growth of plants, and the cycle of agriculture, which was of existential importance for Roman society. While other gods watched over war, power, or love, Ceres stood for the basis of all life, food. Without them there would be no harvest, without harvest no people, and without people no city. In this sense, Ceres was a central figure who ensured the survival of Rome and at the same time had a strong emotional connection to the daily lives of the people. Its origins go far back into the early Italic religion. Even in the agricultural communities of central Italy, a female deity was worshipped to watch over the grain and the harvest. With contact with the Greeks, this figure was identified with Demeter, whose myths and characteristics were transferred to Ceres. But the Romans gave it its own imprint. While Demeter in Greece was more closely associated with the myth of Persephone and the change of the seasons, Ceres focused on the practical aspect of agriculture. She was the goddess who granted protection and blessings to farmers, blessed the seeds, and ensured the prosperity of the fields. An important cult of Ceres emerged in the 5th century BC, when Rome was experiencing a severe famine. During this time, a temple on the Aventine Hill was dedicated to her together with Liber and Libera. This so-called Aventine Triassic was closely connected to the plebeian people and symbolized the proximity of Ceres to the common people. She was not only a goddess of the nobility or priests, but a patroness of farmers, merchants, and citizens who were directly dependent on the yield of the fields. Their veneration was thus a religious link between the social classes of Rome. Ceres also played an important role in the Roman festivals. Especially the Cerealia, which was celebrated in April, was dedicated to her veneration. It was a festival that was associated with games in the Circus Maximus, but also with sacrifices and prayers for good harvests. A remarkable part of this festival was the driving of foxes with burning torches through the arena. This strange ritual was supposed to symbolically cleanse the fields and drive away pests in order to secure Ceres' protection for the harvest. It shows how strongly religion and everyday life were connected in Rome and how rituals took up concrete concerns of daily life. In addition, Ceres also had a closer connection to the cycles of life and fertility. Women called on her on maternity issues, farmers on sowing, and entire communities asked her for protection from famine. In this function, Ceres embodied not only the fertility of the earth, but also the permanence of the community. She was a goddess who gave and preserved life, and was therefore closely linked to the ideas of birth and continuity. The mythological dimension of Ceres was particularly evident in her connection to her daughter Proserpina, who was abducted by Pluto into the underworld. This myth, which the Romans adopted from the Greeks, explained the change of seasons. While Proserpina was in the underworld, Ceres mourned and made the earth barren. When her daughter returned, fertility returned. For the Romans, this was not only an explanation of nature, but also a symbol of loss, hope, and renewal. Ceres thus reflected the human experience of grief and joy, death and rebirth. Politically, the veneration of Ceres was also significant. As it was closely linked to the plebeian people, it was considered a symbol of social justice and community fruitfulness. Their temple on the Aventine Hill was not only a religious but also a political center in which the interests of the plebeians were represented. This gave her cult a special explosiveness, as it bridged the gap between patricians and plebeians and presented a goddess who was equally important for all classes. In art, Ceres was usually depicted with ears of corn, fruit, or a cornucopia, symbols of abundance and fertility. These depictions made it clear that she was the giver of food and wealth. She also often appeared with a torch in her hand, a reference to her search for Proserpina, but also a symbol of light and hope. These images shaped not only Roman art, but also later representations in the Renaissance and modern times, in which Ceres returned as an allegory of summer or agriculture. Their cult reached far beyond Rome. In the provinces, especially in North Africa and Sicily, where large quantities of grain were produced, the veneration of Ceres was particularly strong. There she was seen as the patron goddess of the wealth that fed Rome. This regional anchoring made her a universal goddess who was important not only for Rome, but for the entire empire. With the rise of Christianity, Ceres lost its importance, but its image endured. Traces of their symbolism can be found in many depictions of fruits and harvests in medieval art. The cornucopia, the ears of corn, and the idea of a female figure giving food have their roots in the worship of Ceres. To this day, her name lives on in the word cereal for grain, an indication of the lasting effect of her worship. Ceres was more than a fertility goddess for the Romans. She was the guarantor of daily bread, patron saint of the community, and symbol of the eternal cycle of life, death, and return. Her closeness to people made her a goddess who was not distant and unapproachable, but remained directly connected to the worries and hopes of everyday life. By honoring Ceres, the Romans honored life itself, the power that nourished them and the earth that was their home. Chapter 13. Vesta, goddess of hearth fire. Vesta was one of the oldest and at the same time holiest deities in Rome. She embodied the hearth fire, the center of the house and the family, and at the same time the fire of the state, which burned in the temple of Vesta and was never allowed to go out. Her worship was marked by a deep simplicity. There were no ostentatious statues of Vesta, no great myths about her adventures or passions. Instead, in Roman religion, it was a silent but indispensable force that stood for constancy, purity, and the continuity of the community. Its origins go far back into the early Italic religion. Long before the rise of Rome, people worshipped a female deity who watched over the fire. In a world without modern technology, the hearth fire was of existential importance. It provided warmth, made cooking possible, protected against darkness, and was a symbol of life itself. By worshipping Vesta, the Romans therefore honored the most elementary of all forces that permeated everyday life. Vesta's most important place of worship was her temple on the Roman Forum. It was round and thus reminded of the shape of the old huts in which the hearths of the families burned. In this temple, the sacred fire of the city was guarded, which was never allowed to go out. If it did go out, It was considered a bad omen that threatened the very existence of Rome. This fire was not an ordinary fire, but a symbol of the community and the continued existence of the state. As long as it burned, Rome also existed. The guardians of this fire were the Vestal Virgins, an order of priestesses that was one of the most prestigious institutions of the Roman religion. Girls from noble families were selected at a young age to live in the service of Vesta for 30 years. During this time, they had to observe strict rules, especially the vow of chastity. Their purity was considered a mirror of the purity of the fire they guarded. If they violated this vow, they were threatened with a cruel punishment. They were buried alive because their blood was not allowed to flow. This harshness shows the central importance of the Vestal Virgins for the religious and political life of Rome. In return, the Vestal Virgins enjoyed extraordinary privileges. They were above many social rules, had their own carriages, seats at games, and political authority. They were seen as embodiments of purity and inviolability, and their word carried weight in public affairs. They symbolized the connection between religion and state in a way that was unique, female priestesses who held the fate of Rome in their hands by preserving the sacred fire. In contrast to many other cults, the worship of Vesta was simple and inconspicuous. There were no statues or magnificent images, as it was believed that the goddess herself was invisible. Their presence was manifested only in the fire. Sacrifices to Vesta often consisted of simple foods such as cakes or grains, not elaborate animal sacrifices. This simplicity corresponded to her nature. Vesta was the goddess of purity, constancy, and the quiet but indispensable life. Vesta was always present in the everyday life of the Romans. Each house had a hearth fire, which was considered sacred and which was regularly honored with small sacrifices. Families asked Vesta for protection when they gathered for meals or founded new houses. The stove was not only a practical place, but also a spiritual center of the house. By venerating Vesta, one honored the community, the family, and the continuity of life. Their festival, the Vestalia, was celebrated in June. During this time, the temple of Vesta was open to women who entered barefoot and made offerings. It was a festival of purification and remembrance of the importance of the hearth fire. At the same time, it was an opportunity to honor the Vestal Virgins, whose service was considered a guarantee of Rome's continued existence. The symbolic significance of Vesta was far-reaching. It stood for purity, protection, and the eternal flame of community. While other gods embodied adventures, passions, and conflicts, Vesta was a quiet, reliable presence. She embodied the principle that true strength does not always lie in struggle or abundance of power, but in constancy, purity, and the ability to hold communities together. With the rise of Christianity, the cult of Vesta was finally abolished. Emperor Theodosius ordered the closure of their temple in the 4th century AD, and the sacred fire was extinguished for good. For many Romans, this was a painful sign that an entire era was coming to an end. But the image of the holy flame lived on, in Christianity as a symbol of the Holy Spirit or the eternal candle in churches. The reverence for purity and consistency as central values also remained. For the Romans, Vesta was a goddess without great myths, without dramatic stories, but precisely for this reason of unique importance. It did not stand for the extraordinary moments, but for the everyday, the life that goes on as long as the fire burns. The Romans saw it as the invisible force that held family and state together. Her quiet presence made her a goddess who impressed not with pomp, but with the simple but unshakable truth that without fire there can be no community. Chapter 14. Saturn, the old god of the Golden Age. In Roman religion, Saturn was a figure who embodied awe, nostalgia, and hope at the same time. He was considered the god of seed and agriculture, but the memory of an ancient, mythical age that the Romans called the Golden Age also lived on in him. In this distant epoch, it was believed, people lived without hunger, without war, and without injustice. It was a time of abundance, equality, and peace, and Saturn was its ruler. Even though this time had passed irretrievably, it remained in the Roman imagination an ideal that was kept alive in festivals and myths. The origins of Saturn are complex and multi-layered. On the one hand, he was an Italian god of seeds, who was closely linked to the agricultural way of life of the early Romans. On the other hand, the Romans adopted many elements of the Greek Kronos myth, in which Saturn's figure as the ancient god of the past was shaped. This connection led to Saturn being both a local deity of the earth and a cosmic father of the gods, who ruled over Jupiter in myths. When Jupiter took power, Saturn was dethroned and exiled, but he remained a revered figure in Rome who had given people the basics of agriculture. His most important place of worship was located at the foot of the Capitol in the heart of Rome, the Temple of Saturn. It was one of the oldest temples in the city, and it housed the state coffers, highlighting its connection to prosperity and fertility. Saturn was therefore not only a god of the past, but also a guarantor of the wealth and stability of the state. The fact that he was entrusted with the management of the treasure shows how much he was associated with abundance and abundance. Saturn's greatest importance, however, came from the festival of Saturnalia, which was celebrated in December. These feasts were unique in the Roman calendar, as they overrode the usual social and societal rules. Masters and slaves exchanged roles. Slaves were allowed to speak freely, behave like masters, and were served by their masters. Gifts were exchanged, there was an exuberant atmosphere, and people wore colorful clothes instead of the usual simple toga. This reversal of order was reminiscent of the Golden Age, when there had been no hierarchies, no inequality, and no oppression. For the Romans, the Saturnalia was not only a cause for joy, but also an outlet that relieved social tensions. By reversing the roles for a few days, the existing order was confirmed at the same time. But for many people, it was also a time of hope, a reminder that there could be a world without oppression, even if it could only be experienced in myth or in a short festival. Later, Saturnalia influenced customs of the Middle Ages and even our modern Christmases, for example through gift-giving and the festive atmosphere. In mythology, Saturn had an ambivalent role. He was seen as the father of Jupiter and the other great gods, who wanted to devour them in fear of being disempowered. It was only when Jupiter rose up against him that Saturn was toppled and pushed to the margins. This narrative reflects the eternal theme of the generational conflict that determines the order of the world. At the same time, she made Saturn a tragic figure, a god who once ruled, but now had to recede into the background to make way for the new order. Despite his fall, Saturn remained a venerable figure for the Romans. He was not the enemy, but the father whose time had passed, but whose gifts, agriculture, order, prosperity, formed the foundation of the present. By worshipping Saturn, the Romans honored not only an ancient god, but also the memory of their own origins and the values of the community. His depiction was usually that of an old man with a beard, sometimes with a sickle in his hand, which reminded us of his role as the god of the seed. In this form, it became a symbol of the past, but also of time itself. Some Romans associated it with the idea of Chronos, who embodied time and determined all life. Saturn therefore stood not only for fertility, but also for the cycle of life and the passing of generations. Politically, the Saturnalia had a special function. They reminded the people that power could not be taken for granted and that order and wealth could only be maintained through the favor of the gods. For the upper class, the festivals were an opportunity to show themselves to be generous and close to the people, while the common people were allowed to experience equality and freedom for a short time. Saturn's cult thus acted as a link between the past, present, and future. With the advent of Christianity and the end of the old religions, the worship of Saturn also disappeared, but its traces remained. The Saturnalia lived on in the customs of the European Middle Ages, such as the Fool's Festivals or the carnivalesque reversals of order. His name also lives on in language. Saturday, dies Saturni, still bears his name in many languages today, and the distant planet Saturn is a reminder of his ancient rule. For the Romans, Saturn was a god of seeds, abundance, and the memory of a better time. He embodied the ideal of a life in harmony, free from hunger and war, and at the same time the recognition that all order is transient. His cult combined reverence for the past, gratitude for the present, and hope for a return of abundance. For the Romans, Saturn was the wise, old god who gave them agriculture and reminded them that all life is in the cycle of becoming and passing away. Chapter 15. Pluto Dispater, ruler of the underworld. Pluto, whom the Romans also called Dispater, was the god of the underworld, ruler of the realms of the dead and at the same time guardian of the hidden riches of the earth. His figure was characterized by awe and fear in equal measure, because he stood for the inevitable fate of every human being, death. But Pluto was not only a dark god of the end, but also a figure of abundance and wealth, because in the depths of the earth not only the dead, but also metals, gemstones, and fertility were hidden. This double meaning made him a complex figure who demanded respect, fear, and gratitude from the Romans at the same time. Its roots go back to the Greek Hades, which the Romans adopted almost completely. But as with many gods, they gave it its own traits. While Hades often appears in Greek myth as a dark, secluded god, Pluto also took on a positive dimension in the Roman context. His nickname Dispater means rich father, and refers to his function as a donor of mineral resources and fertility. For a society that lived from agriculture and whose prosperity was also based on mines and metal trade, this side of Pluto was of great importance. In the imagination of the Romans, the underworld lay deep underground, a dark realm ruled by Pluto. This is where the souls of the dead came after their death. Unlike Greek mythology, which divided the afterlife into different areas such as Elysium or Tartaros, the Roman idea was often less differentiated. More important than the exact geography was the conviction that Pluto was a just but relentless ruler of the dead. His power was absolute, for no one could escape his kingdom. A central myth, which was also known in the Roman context, was the kidnapping of Proserpina, the daughter of Ceres. Pluto fell in love with her and led her into his kingdom, whereupon her mother made the earth barren. Only a compromise allowed Proserpina to spend part of the year with her mother, while she had to spend the rest in the underworld. This story explained the change of seasons and made Pluto a figure closely linked to the cycle of life, death, and rebirth. Pluto was usually depicted in art as a serious, majestic figure, often with a scepter or a key, symbol of his rule over the gates of the underworld. Another attribute was the three-headed dog Cerberus, who guarded the entrances to his kingdom and did not let anyone escape. Unlike other gods, who were often honored in temples and festivals, Pluto's cult was characterized by a certain restraint. His name was seldom called out loud, for fear of attracting his attention. His power was so great that it was better to appease him than to challenge him. Nevertheless, there were important cults in his honor. Particularly famous was the Munda Ceres, a sacred pit in Rome that was considered the gateway to the underworld. 3 times a year this shaft was opened, and it was believed that in these days the spirits of the dead roamed freely. Sacrifices to Pluto and Proserpina were intended to ensure that the spirits remained appeased. These festivals showed the close connection between religion and ancestor worship, which played a central role for the Romans. Death was not a distant mystery, but part of daily life, and Pluto was at the center of this inescapable reality. Another dimension of his being was the connection to the wealth of the earth. As Dispater, he was considered a donor of the mineral resources that were decisive for Rome's prosperity. Gold, silver, iron, all of these were extracted from the earth and thus understood as a gift from the god. The fertility of the fields, which emerged from the dark earth, was also attributed to his power. Thus, in Pluto, the darkness of death was combined with the hope of new life and material abundance. The Romans did not see Pluto as an evil god. He was not an enemy of men, but a necessary ruler who watched over the fate that awaited all. His severity was an expression of order, not cruelty. He embodied the certainty that death was a part of life and that behind the visible world there was a greater power that watched over justice. This attitude made dealing with death both terrible and bearable for the Romans. In Roman literature, Pluto appears as a serious, respectful figure. Poets such as Virgil or Ovid described him in their poetry as a powerful god who was both revered and feared. The underworld plays a central role in Virgil's Aeneid in particular, and Aeneas's encounter with Pluto and the dead emphasizes the importance of the afterlife for the fate of Rome. With the rise of Christianity, Pluto was increasingly equated with the Christian image of the devil or hell. However, his figure was fundamentally different. He was not the epitome of evil, but a righteous ruler of the realm of the dead. Nevertheless, the fusion of his figure with negative ideas led to his original meaning being forgotten. Pluto, or Dispater, was for the Romans a god who embodied the inevitable part of life. He was the guardian of death, but also the giver of wealth and fertility. It reflected the deep wisdom that life and death are inseparably linked, that not only the end but also new life grows out of the earth. For the Romans, he was not a distant figure of terror, but a necessary part of the divine order, which at the same time instilled fear in them and demanded gratitude. By honoring Pluto, they recognized the limits of their existence and honored the power that lay hidden in the darkness of the earth. Chapter 16. Janus, god of beginnings and transitions. Janus was a unique figure in Roman religion that had no direct equivalent in Greek mythology. While many Roman gods were adopted from Greece or closely linked to Greek models, Janus was a genuinely Roman deity. He embodied the beginnings, transitions, and thresholds. His power lay wherever a process began or a line was crossed, be it in everyday life, in politics, in time, or in religion. Janus was the god who opened and closed doors, who determined the beginning of the day, the month, and the year, and who therefore played a central role in Roman thought. Probably the most famous feature of Janus was its double face. He was almost always depicted as a two-faced figure who looked forward and backward at the same time. This image symbolized his ability to see the past and the future, to direct the transition from one state to the other, and to conceive of the present as a threshold between the two. In this sense, Janus was a god of time as well as of space. He watched over doors, gates, and city gates, over beginning and end, over departure and homecoming. The month of January still bears his name today. As the first month of the year, it symbolized the transition from the old to the new, and so Janus was considered the guardian of the beginning of the year. In all important events and rituals, he was invoked first, even before Jupiter or other great gods were mentioned. It was believed that no sacrifice could succeed unless Janus had first opened the doors and paved the way. This primacy makes it clear that in the eyes of the Romans he was not so much an ordinary god as a cosmic principle that underpinned all beginnings. His most important sanctuary was the Temple of Janus on the Roman Forum. This building was famous because its gates were opened when Rome was at war and closed when there was peace. Throughout Rome's long history, the gates have almost always remained open, as Rome has been constantly involved in military conflicts. The rare moments when the gates were closed were therefore considered outstanding events and a sign of divine favor. The Temple of Janus was thus not only a religious, but also a political measure of the state of the empire. Janus was closely associated with the idea of transitions. Anyone who entered or left a house was symbolically under his protection. Anyone who began a new journey asked Janus for assistance. Even everyday actions such as opening a door were associated with his name. This omnipresence made him a deity who was not distant and enraptured, but worked directly in people's lives. Janus also occupied a special position in mythology. Some traditions saw him as an ancient king of Latium, who had ruled in a peaceful and golden age. He was considered a bringer of culture who gave people agriculture and laws. In this capacity, he was sometimes associated with Saturn, which was also associated with the Golden Age. Janus was therefore not only a god of the thresholds, but also a wise ruler who brought the foundations of civilization to mankind. His attributes reflected his power over beginning and end. The key and staff were among his symbols. The key to open and close doors, the staff to guide travelers. These signs made him a god who not only embodied abstract concepts, but also guided concrete actions. The Romans saw him as a guardian who mediated between chaos and order by directing and structuring transitions. Religiously, Janus had a high status, even if he did not enjoy the same popular cult as Jupiter, Mars, or Venus. He was not so much a god of myth and stories, but rather a god of principle. His worship was simple but fundamental. Without him, no ritual could begin, no journey could be safe, no new phase in life could be under happy omens. This role as an opener made him an indispensable deity, whose importance was silent but omnipresent. Politically, the emperors also used his symbolism. The closed temple of Janus became a sign of peace, which was exploited for propaganda purposes. Augustus, for example, emphasized that he closed the gates after his victories to show that his reign had ushered in a new era of peace. In this way, Janus also indirectly became a symbol of imperial power and divine legitimacy. With the end of the pagan religion, the official cult of Janus also disappeared, but his image lived on. To this day, January commemorates him, and his two-faced face has become a symbol of transitions and ambiguity. In literature and art, Janus often stands for the ability to look at the past and the future at the same time, for new beginnings and retrospectives, for the threshold that connects two worlds. For the Romans, Janus was a god of special character. Not a mighty celestial god like Jupiter, not a god of war like Mars, not a symbol of passion like Venus. Rather, he was a god of transitions, of the quiet but decisive moments that determined life. By worshipping Janus, the Romans recognized that every beginning and every end required divine guidance. He was the silent guardian of the in-between, the invisible guardian of the thresholds, without whom neither houses, nor journeys, nor years could be safely entered. Chapter 17. Minor deities, the little gods of everyday life, house spirits, lares, penates. In addition to the large, widely known gods such as Jupiter, Mars, or Venus, smaller deities also played a decisive role in Roman religion. These so-called minor deities were no less important for everyday life, because they protected house and farm, accompanied families, watched over individual places or activities, and thus gave the Romans a feeling of security on a small scale. The lares and penates in particular were the focus of attention, household gods familiar to every Roman, from simple peasants to emperors. They were the constant companions of everyday life, closer and more tangible than the great gods, whose power often seemed far away. The lares were originally guardian spirits of fields, paths, and places. Over time, however, they were revered above all as guardians of families and homes. Each household had a small sanctuary, the lararium, in which figures of the lares were displayed. There they were regularly offered sacrifices, small dishes, wine, or incense. They were considered invisible guardians of the house, watching over prosperity, health, and safety. Especially at meals, they were commemorated by offering them the first bite or drop of wine. In this way, the lares were deeply anchored in daily life. The penates had a similar function, but differed in their origin. They were considered guardians of the pantheon food, especially the grain, which formed the foundation of the Roman diet. While the lares protected the house as a whole, the penates watched over the inner core of survival, food and supplies. In many Roman families, statuettes of the penates stood in the lararium next to the lares, so that both groups of guardian spirits were worshipped together. This proximity shows how important it was for the Romans to provide spiritual security and care. The Roman state also knew penates, the so-called penates publici. These were considered the patron gods of the whole community and were worshipped in the temple on Velia Hill. This combined the domestic idea of protection and food with the state dimension. Just as the house could not exist on a small scale without the penates, so Rome as a whole could not survive without them. This parallel illustrates how much Roman religion reflected the same structures from the household to the empire. In addition to the Lares and Penates, there were a large number of other small deities who supervised certain areas of life. The genii, for example, were personal guardian spirits who were placed at the side of every human being from birth. It was believed that genius embodied the creative principle that gave life and strength to every human being. Birthdays in Rome were not celebrated primarily for the person, but for his genius. Communities, legions, or even entire places also had their own genius, which shows that this idea went far beyond the individual. The variety of these lesser deities was almost inexhaustible. There were gods and spirits for doors, thresholds, cornfields, springs, and even for activities such as plowing or sowing. This multiplicity may seem exaggerated from today's perspective, but for the Romans it was an expression of a world permeated by divine forces. No area of life was left to chance. There were powers at work everywhere that had to be honored and appeased. The religious practice of dealing with these gods was less solemn than the great state cults, but no less serious. Offerings in the house were small gestures of gratitude that were repeated daily. The Lararia, often ornately decorated with frescoes, were centers of family spirituality. This is where the family gathered, where prayers were said, and where contact with the ancestors was maintained. The Lares were often identified with their deceased ancestors, who continued to watch over their descendants as guardian spirits. In this connection, religion merged with the cult of ancestors, which played a prominent role in Rome. This proximity made the minor deities particularly important for the Roman self-image. While Jupiter or Mars were far away in the sky, Lares, Penates, and genii were immediately present. They stood in the house, in the storeroom, accompanied people on journeys or watched over fields. Their power was not abstract, but could be experienced concretely. If a harvest was successful, the house remained unscathed, one felt healthy, all of this was attributed to their protection. There are also numerous references to these household gods in literature. Poets such as Ovid or Virgil mention them in their works, showing how deeply they were anchored in cultural memory. Virgil's Aeneid in particular emphasizes the importance of the Penates, as Aeneas takes the Penates with him on his flight from Troy. They embodied not only his family, but also the fate of the future Rome. This episode makes it clear that the little gods played a role not only privately, but also in the great myth. With the rise of Christianity, the Lares and Penates did not disappear immediately. Many of their functions were transferred to Christian saints or to the idea of guardian angels. The practice of setting up home altars or small prayer rooms also remained, albeit in a new religious form. In this way, the little gods continued to live indirectly, even if their names and rites were forgotten. The minor deities show how comprehensively the Roman religion permeated life. They did not stand for distant ideals, but for closeness, protection, and everyday experience. By worshipping Lares, Penates, genii, and many other minor deities, the Romans created a network of spiritual security that accompanied their lives in all areas. These gods were the invisible companions of every family, quietly and inconspicuously ensuring that daily life endured. For the Romans, the great gods were symbols of power, glory, and cosmic order. The little gods, however, were the ones who made it possible to experience every day that life was carried by divine forces. Lares, Penates, and genii gave a spiritual depth to everyday life, connecting the fate of the family with the fate of the empire. They reminded people that the divine is also present in small things, in the hearth fire, in the storeroom, on the paths, and in the inconspicuous gestures of everyday life. Chapter 18. Roman Religion in Everyday Life and Its Rituals. The Roman religion was not only a collection of myths and cults that took place in magnificent temples or at large state festivals, but above all a living practice that permeated people's everyday lives. For the Romans, religion was inseparable from daily life. Every action, whether small or large, could have divine significance and needed to be secured by rites, sacrifices, or prayers. This ubiquitous religiosity reflected the conviction that the well-being of family, city, and empire depended directly on the favor of the gods. Religion already played a central role in the domestic environment. As mentioned in the previous chapter, the Lares and Penates were at the center of the family cult. The hearth fire was considered a sacred place where offerings were made. At meals, the gods were always left with the first part of food or drink. Important events in the life of the family, birth, marriage, or death, were also accompanied by rituals that were supposed to secure the consent of the gods. Even the foundation of a house or crossing the threshold could be accompanied by religious acts. The Roman calendar was full of feast days that structured the course of the year. Almost not a month went by without several religious festivals. These not only served to honor the gods, but also reminded people that each part of the year was under divine influence. Thus February was devoted to the time of purification, March to the beginning of the military year, October to the end of the campaigns. The calendar was thus less a neutral calculation of time than a religious framework that ordered and structured the year. A central principle of the Roman religion was the do ut des, I give so that you give. Sacrificial acts always had a practical purpose. Food, animals, or incense were given to the gods to win their favor or to appease their anger. The Romans did not see the gods as omniscient and benevolent beings, but as powers that could be controlled by rites. This pragmatic attitude led to the religion being highly ritualized. Every action had to be carried out according to strict rules, as it was believed that even small mistakes could nullify the effect. The sacrificial acts differed according to occasion and meaning. Small house sacrifices usually consisted of bread, fruit, or wine. On larger occasions, animals were sacrificed, bulls for Jupiter, pigs for Ceres, goats for Faunus. The sacrifice was a solemn act in which the animal was adorned, sprinkled with holy water and sprinkled with flour before it was slaughtered. Parts of the meat were consecrated to the gods, others were eaten at a communal meal. Victims were therefore not only religious acts, but also social events that created community. The priests also played an important role in everyday religious life. There were numerous priestly colleges, each of which was responsible for certain cults, such as the Flamines, who looked after individual deities, or the pontifices, who were responsible for the order of the calendar and rituals. Particularly important was the College of Augurs, who interpreted the will of the gods by observing birds or other signs. No political decision, no declaration of war was allowed to take place without augurial confirmation. Thus, religion was closely intertwined with politics and determined the actions of the state as well as those of the family. In addition to the official rites, there were numerous small gestures that accompanied everyday life. A traveler said a short prayer before leaving. A farmer invoked the gods before he put the plow in the ground. One soldier made sacrifices before going into battle. This multitude of small acts made religion ubiquitous. One lived with the awareness of being constantly surrounded by divine forces, which could be well-disposed or hostile. The Roman accuracy in religious matters was particularly striking. While other peoples often told their myths and gods with poetic freedom, the Romans attached great importance to the correct execution of the rites. A mistake in a victim could mean that it had to be repeated. This strictness shows that religion was understood less as a matter of feeling and more as a kind of contract with the gods. As long as you followed the rules, you could be sure of their favor. At the same time, the Roman religion was open and adaptable. New cults from the provinces could be integrated into everyday life, as long as they did not contradict state norms. For example, the Isis cult from Egypt or the Mithras cult from Persia found their way into Rome and were adopted by many people into their everyday lives. This openness made the religion flexible and allowed many traditions to develop side by side. Religion also permeated political life. The Senate and the emperors used religious rituals to legitimize their power. Triumphs, buildings and laws were accompanied by sacrificial acts. Even military victories were seen not only as the result of human strategy, but as an expression of divine support. In this respect, religion was the foundation on which politics and society rested. With the rise of Christianity, religious life changed fundamentally. Many of the old rituals disappeared, but the close connection between everyday life and religion remained. Christianity also structured people's lives through festivals, prayers, and rituals. In some respects, the old practice lived on, albeit under different auspices. For the Romans, religion was not an area apart from everyday life, but the foundation that permeated all areas of life. Rituals, sacrifices, and festivals made the divine tangible and gave life order and security. Roman religion in everyday life was therefore less spectacular than the myths of the great gods, but it was at the heart of a culture that understood its entire existence in a constant relationship with the gods. Chapter 19. The influence of Greek mythology on the Roman gods. In its origins, the Roman religion was a down-to-earth world of beliefs characterized by agricultural cycles and everyday rituals. But with the expansion of Rome beyond Italy and the intensive contact with Greek culture, it changed fundamentally. The influence of Greek mythology on the Roman gods was so strong that many figures that we now consider to be typically Roman actually have Greek origins. However, it is important to emphasize that the Romans did not simply adopt these influences, but adapted them to give them their own Roman imprint. This process is most evident in the names and functions of the gods. Almost every great Roman god has a Greek counterpart. Jupiter corresponds to Zeus, Juno to Hera, Mars to Ars, Venus to Aphrodite, Neptune to Poseidon, and so on. The Romans often adopted the myths associated with these figures, but adapted them to their own worldview. While the Greeks placed great emphasis on the narration of adventures, passions, and conflicts, the Romans focused more on the political and social function of the deities. The gods were seen less as characters in exciting stories and more as guardians of order, protectors of the state and companions of everyday life. An example of this is Mars. In Greek mythology, ours was an ambivalent figure who was often portrayed as bloodthirsty and uncontrolled. The Greeks did not revere him very much, as he stood for the chaotic and destructive nature of war. The Romans, however, made Mars their most important god of war and at the same time the mythical father of Rome. He did not embody senseless violence, but discipline, strength, and the protection of the community. This shows how a Greek model was adopted and transferred into a new cultural meaning. It was similar with Venus. Her Greek sister Aphrodite stood for passion, jealousy, and intrigue in many myths. Although the Romans adopted her beauty and her role as the goddess of love, they also gave her a political dimension. Venus became the progenitor of the Roman people through the descent of Aeneas. This made her not only a goddess of passion, but also a symbolic figure for the origin and legitimacy of Roman power. Jupiter also shows this process. As a Roman counterpart to Zeus, he adopted many characteristics of the Greek father of the gods. But while Zeus often appeared in numerous love affairs and intrigues, Jupiter in Rome was primarily the guardian of the laws, the protector of the state and the guarantor of the divine order. The Romans gave it a dignity and seriousness that was better suited to their own self-image as a sober and disciplined state power. The influence of the Greeks was not only evident in the gods themselves, but also in the arts and rituals. Temples, statues, and cult images were strongly based on Greek models. Where the early Roman religion had rather simple altars and rituals, a rich iconography developed under Greek influence. The gods were given human form, worshipped in magnificent temples and decorated in myths that did not originally belong to Rome. Thus, the Roman religion was transformed from a simple, agrarian tradition into a complex system with an impressive artistic dimension. Literature was another area in which Greek mythology had a profound influence. Poets such as Virgil, Ovid, and Seneca drew on Greek myths to retell them in a Roman context. Virgil's Aeneid combines Greek narrative tradition with Roman national myth. Ovid's Metamorphoses is full of Greek material, which he translated into Latin and provided with the Roman spirit. In this way, Greek myths became part of Roman culture and shaped the thinking and feeling of the Romans for centuries. Greek influence also played a role in the provinces. Since the Romans encountered a rich religious tradition in the Hellenistic world, they adopted many cults almost unchanged. In cities such as Athens, Corinth, or Alexandria, Romans encountered the gods in Greek form, and these images in turn flowed back to Rome. The exchange was therefore not only one-sided, but a living process that intertwined the religion of both cultures. Despite all these influences, the Roman religion remained independent. Roman pragmatism and its focus on the welfare of the state clearly distinguished it from Greek mythology, which relied more on individual narratives and personal dramas. While the Greeks portrayed their gods with all their faults and weaknesses, the Romans tended to see them as serious and dignified figures who embodied order and stability. The adaptation was therefore not a mere copying, but a creative process of transformation. The influence of Greek mythology on Rome shows how open and adaptable Roman culture was. Rome did not simply adopt foreign traditions, but integrated them in such a way that they fit its own identity. In this way, a pantheon was created that was both Greek-inspired and yet unmistakably Roman. This ability to absorb foreign elements and transfer them into a new order was a key to Rome's cultural and political greatness. For the Romans, the encounter with Greek mythology therefore meant more than just enrichment through stories and myths. It was part of a larger process in which Rome formed its own identity, pragmatic, state-oriented, yet open to the foreign. The Greek myths became Roman truths, the gods became the guardians of Rome, and the old stories found a new place in the world power that had grown out of a small city-state. Chapter 20. The End of the Old Gods, Transition to Christianity. The Roman religion, which had shaped public and private life for centuries, was on the verge of a profound change in the 4th century AD. The ancient gods, who were once worshipped in temples, festivals, and rituals, gradually lost their meaning. It was replaced by Christianity, which had initially been a small, persecuted sect, but eventually became the state religion of the Roman Empire. This transition not only marked the end of the old cults, but also a profound cultural and spiritual upheaval that changed the world forever. The causes of the decline of traditional religions were manifold. On the one hand, the old gods had changed a lot over the centuries. The simple protective powers of everyday life had become complex figures who were venerated in magnificent temples, but often fulfilled political rather than religious functions. The connection between religion and state, which had long been a sign of Rome's strength, now became a problem. Many people felt alienated from the old rituals, which often seemed more like bureaucratic duties than personal acts of faith. On the other hand, Christianity offered a new, emotional, and personal form of religion. It promised not only protection in everyday life, but eternal life after death, comfort in suffering, and a close relationship with a single God who loved all people equally. This message particularly appealed to the lower classes of society, who often received little attention in the traditional cult complexes. While Jupiter and Mars represented the power of the state, Christ promised dignity and hope to the poor, slaves, and disenfranchised. The persecution of Christians in the 1st to 3rd centuries AD could not prevent the rise of this new religion. On the contrary, the martyrdom of many believers made them symbolic figures of faith and convinced more and more people of the strength and seriousness of the Christian message. At the same time, the Roman Empire increasingly opened up to foreign cults from the East, which also created strong emotional bonds. Christianity was able to grow and establish itself in this environment. The 4th century brought a decisive turning point. Emperor Constantine the Great ended the persecution of Christians with the Edict of Milan in 313 AD. He granted tolerance to all religions, but promoted Christianity to a special degree. Constantine himself was baptized and increasingly understood his rule as legitimized by Christ. This marked the beginning of the close connection between Christianity and the Roman state, which later led to the complete victory of the new religion. The real break with the old gods, however, came under Emperor Theodosius I, who declared Christianity the sole state religion at the end of the 4th century. With the so-called Theodosian laws, pagan cults were banned, temples were closed and sacrificial acts were prohibited. As a result, the old religions lost not only their public function, but also their social basis. The gods who had once formed the heart of Rome were banished from public life. This transition was not without resistance. Many people, especially in the countryside, held on to the old customs for a long time. Even when the temples were closed, numerous traditions survived in secret rituals or in altered forms. In some regions, local deities continued to be worshipped, often under Christian names or mixed with cults of saints. But the political and intellectual development was irreversible. Christianity prevailed and henceforth shaped European culture. It is noteworthy that many elements of the old religion did not disappear completely, but continued to live on in a new form. The idea of holy flames, as they burned in the Temple of Vesta, was found in the Christian symbolism of eternal light. Festivals such as the Saturnalia influenced customs that were later associated with Christmas. The worship of guardian spirits also turned into the idea of angels or saints. In this way, a part of the old world survived, albeit in a new language. For the Romans themselves, the transition was a deep turning point. With the end of the old gods, they lost not only religious practices, but also a piece of their cultural identity. Jupiter, Mars, Venus, Vesta, they had all structured life for centuries, legitimized wars, determined festivals, and carried the sense of community. Their disappearance meant that an entire worldview came to an end. But at the same time, it opened the way for a new spiritual order that was not based on many gods, but on a single, all-encompassing God. The transition from polytheism to monotheism was one of the greatest upheavals of antiquity. It changed not only the religious landscape, but also politics, society, and culture. Christianity created a new unity that was not limited to city or empire, but went beyond borders. It was a religion that laid claim to the whole world and thus opened up a dimension that went far beyond the old cult communities. Thus, the era of the old gods ended not in a sudden collapse, but in a gradual transition. The rituals that once applied to Jupiter, Mars, and Venus became new customs dedicated to Christ and the saints. The temples became churches, the festivals became Christian holidays. The memory of the old gods remained alive, but their power was broken. The end of the old gods and the rise of Christianity marked the end of a world and the beginning of a new era. For centuries, the Romans had lived in a religious diversity in which every area of life was determined by divine forces. Now began a time in which a single god was at the center, a god who displaced the old gods, but at the same time carried on much of their heritage. This transition shows not only a religious change, but a deep cultural break that laid the foundation for the Middle Ages and the world as we know it today.